Welcome to Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC Show. We will see you in about 45 seconds or so. Make sure that you are subscribing to our channels, our LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. Turn on notifications, and we are very excited to be here with you.
So those things that we ask our students to do.
It's almost time, about 30 more seconds. Make sure to grab your notebook and pen so you can jot down notes along the way, because at the end of the show, you could have an opportunity to ask our guests questions so we can dive a little deeper into these topics. And here we go. Welcome to Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC Show. Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC Show. So this is a topic that I personally struggle with. And we have the master of Psychrometrics with us today, Professor Eugene Silverstein. How are you, sir?
Great. It's nice to be with you. I just have to comment really quickly. I said that intro montage, that covered like 30 years of my life.
I tried. I know. I had some fun with it. I spent probably an hour in my inventory going through photos going, there's a fun one, there's a fun one, there's a good one right there.
Maybe there's a couple more you have to get rid of.
So the reason I want us to start diving a little bit deeper into some of these topics is just to get a better understanding of the environment that we work in, right? So I was a technician most of my career, and I didn't go to formal trade school, which is why I advocate so much for formal trade school now. So I learned through our little company, right? Little family-owned business. So I learned by on-the-job training, and I learned by classes by OEMs and classes at distributors. And I did go back to school quite a few times, taking specialty classes. Whenever I need to get better at welding, well, I went to a trade school and I grabbed some welding classes. I did blueprint classes. I did all electrical, did that for a couple years. But it wasn't until I got out and started doing my own teaching about 6 years ago that I really learned how bad I actually was. And how much I really didn't understand about the industry that I worked in. So I've been trying to learn a lot more of the fundamentals and picking topics that I'm just not incredibly strong with. And I encourage you to do that with us. Let us know topics that you want to dive deeper into, and we'll make sure that we get the best people from the industry to talk about those. So when it comes to psychrometrics, there's no better than our very own Eugene Silverstein. So we're going to dive in. If you have any questions along the way, let us know, and definitely let us know where you're chiming in from so that we can keep track of who all's joining us today.
Awesome. Yeah, Clifton, it's really funny because when we get out in the field, a lot of people, we start in the field and we learn the field.
Yep.
And a lot of people, they know what to do. When I see this, I do this.
I know how to fix this.
I see my gauge needles pointing down here, and they should be up here. I know to go to the truck and get the tank of refrigerant.
Right.
So a lot of times we know what to do, but quite often we don't know why we're doing what we do. And I joke with a lot of people because, and I always ask when I'm teaching a class, I ask people, how many people speak Hebrew? Yeah. And no hands go up typically. Maybe one, maybe two. And the reason I ask that is because if Hebrew, we read right to left.
Yeah.
And in our industry, if you read right to left, you kind of get all your answers, because a lot of us, we consider ourselves to be air conditioning experts. Well, what is an air conditioning expert? An air conditioning expert is someone who's an expert at conditioning air, right? And if it's a long joke about this. I'm not going to get into it, but if we're truly experts at conditioning air, then we owe it to ourselves to really understand air. So how could we possibly be an expert at conditioning air if we actually don't understand what air is? and one of the challenges is that air is except in New York. It's colorless, odorless, and tasteless, for the most part. And it's invisible, so we don't see it, and we take it for granted, and we treat it as if it's something that we really don't. We don't need to know a whole lot about. But
Sure.
air is a fluid.
Air, right?
Air is a fluid, just like water. So we study water. We spend time studying water, and we tend to fluff over air just a little bit. And air can be intimidating because when we talk about psychrometrics, Robert O'Brien, he's from New York. That's what
he understands the air.
So when we're talking about air, it really is a fluid, like I said, such as water. We spend a lot of time talking about water, and we tend to disregard air. I mean, air
is just there.
Air is made of, air conditioning is conditioning of air, but what are we conditioning if we don't understand what air is?
Mm-hmm.
So air is basically two elements. It's nitrogen and oxygen, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, but that's not going to make you a better technician.
Okay.
But what's really important to note is that air is constantly changing. Air contains water. And air contains water in both the liquid state and in the vapor state. And the water that's in the vapor state is condensing to liquid, and the liquid water that's in our air is vaporizing into vapor water. Okay. Yeah. It's constantly changing. So it's a dynamic fluid. So it's really, really interesting. And when we talk about psychrometrics, it's really just studying air and its properties.
Right.
And one of the challenges is we know if I talk to you about oil or refrigerant or gasoline or water, we can quantify it. A lot of us have bottles of water right next to us. And this is about a pint of water, weighs about a pound.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us have lugged jugs of refrigerant around or gasoline cans or oil cans.
Sure.
So we can quantify, what these substances are. But when
it's physical.
But when we talk about this stuff, right? What is this stuff? I always ask teachers and students when I lecture across the country, how much does the air in the room weigh? And they always go like this. And they're like,
weight? Doesn't weigh anything.
It doesn't weigh anything. Usually I get the nothing, because you go like this and it doesn't take
nothing there
of effort. But air actually has significant weight. So just take, for example, the room that I'm in right now is about 12 feet by 14 feet by 10 feet. So roughly 1,680 cubic feet.
Yeah.
So, and actually, a cubic foot of air. Okay. Oh, there you go. That's about a cubic foot.
It's about a cubic foot.
Yeah. Close. Yeah. That's your cooler for once you finish the show.
Oh, buddy.
if we assume standard air, standard atmospheric conditions, 1 cubic foot of air weighs about 0.075 pounds per cubic foot. So the room that I'm in, 12 by 14 by 10, at 0.075 pounds per cubic foot, it's about 126 pounds. So if I took all this air that's in the room and I put it on a scale, we're looking at about 126 pounds. It's a pretty
in the one room.
Yeah, in this little room here. So and it's really, really difficult to quantify. What does a pound of air look like? Because when we're talking about an air conditioning system, we're always measuring airflow in CFM, cubic feet per minute.
Right.
And we never really think about the weight of air. So just really, really quickly, how much is a pound of air? So I put this together real quickly. It's not, it's nothing crazy. I don't want to freak anybody out with math because, 4 out of 3 people have trouble with math. So if I look at 1 pound of air, and I know we just said that 1 cubic foot of air weighs 0.075 pounds, right?
That's a lot of weight for nothing.
And then a cubic foot is 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches. So that's 1,728 cubic inches.
Okay.
And then if you didn't know it, a gallon is actually 231 cubic inches. So if you do the math, you crunch all the numbers.
Yep.
A pound of air takes up about 100 gallons. So if you have two large 50-gallon garbage bags.
Yeah, or bags.
Yeah. When I do my Psychometrics without tears seminar, like at ASHRAE or at our conference,
Bring
I
in two
always
of them.
have these two big bags.
I've seen some photos of that.
Actually, in the
intro,
you had me holding up these two big bags. That's me showing you what a pound of air looks like. But those two 50-gallon bags make up 1 pound of air at standard conditions.
Okay.
And to really drive the point home, what I talk to technicians and even teachers about is think about an air conditioning system that's moving 2,000 CFM of air. So yeah, it's moving 2,000 of those every minute. So so let's say we have an air conditioning system that's moving 2,000 CFM of air, and we turn that fan switch to the on position. Well, that's 2,000 cubic feet per minute. Well, if we extrapolate that out, that's 120,000 cubic feet of air per hour.
Right.
Right. So 2,000 CFM times 60 minutes per hour.
Yep.
And then there are 24 hours in a day. So if we have 120,000 cubic feet per hour, that's 2,880,000 cubic feet of air per day. And again, assuming that we're at standard conditions, standard atmospheric conditions,
air, right?
And air weighs 0.075 pounds per cubic foot, which is 1.2 ounces. So it's actually pretty significant. You're looking at about 100 tons of air per day. So that's 216,000 pounds of air that blower is
moving.
Actually moving. So to quantify that for you, that's the weight of a Boeing 757 twin-engine airliner.
Wow. Okay.
So,
sure.
So that roughly, again, pardon me for being rough,
that
5-ton blower is moving the equivalent weight of a 757 twin-engine airliner every
day.
So it's a little
intimidating. A lot of work.
Yeah. So blowers are actually doing a lot of work. And a lot of us out in the field, we downplay exactly what that blower is doing. Oh, it's just moving air. Because I know when I went out in the field in my younger years and a blower was making noise, I would take some corrugated cardboard and wedge it under the motor mount. It's just air. I just need to get rid of that little rattle.
Yeah.
Not realizing that I literally have a twin engine airliner running through that blower on a daily basis. But the good news is there are so many things that we do to air. All right. As air conditioning experts or somebody who wants to be one.
Sure.
We heat air, we cool air,
we move air,
we move it, we exhaust it, we ventilate it, we humidify, we dehumidify, we filter it. We do a lot of things to air. And everything that we do to air follows a very specific set of rules.
Okay.
And the good news is, the bad news is there are a lot of rules. And the good news is that all of the rules are on that psychometric chart. And typically there's a rule that says when you see more ink on a piece of paper than blank space, run. And that's pretty much the case with the psychometric chart.
I think that's why most people do run from it. It is intimidating when you look at it.
It is, right. So the psychometric chart is really, really intimidating. But the fact is, there are only a handful of properties that we really concern ourselves with air. And the reason the chart is so intimidating is there are so many of each of these lines that it makes the chart look a little crazy.
Yes.
A little busy. Yeah, I would say a lot busy. and nowadays with modern technology, with instrumentation that we have now, a lot of the work gets done for us. So for example, you might have a psychrometer. So a psychrometer is an instrument and years ago we had sling psychrometers,
Oh yeah, used
and
to have one.
there were two physical thermometers in there. Yep, one with a dry bulb.
Yep.
Right,
One
if you
wet.
look at the bulb on the thermometer, it's dry. And then there's a
Mhm.
wet bulb,
Yep, the wicked.
right? And it was had a sock on it
Mhm.
that you had to moisten with distilled water,
Yep.
and then you literally had to spin the psychrometer.
People think we're crazy, but that's how I
Oh yeah,
learned.
oh yeah, absolutely. But now with instrumentation that we have, a lot of the information, wet bulb temperature, dry bulb temperature, relative humidity, can all be obtained
Calculated.
from the psychrometer.
Yeah.
And that makes our lives a lot, easier when we want to truly evaluate what air is doing.
Mhm.
So, it really is about investing in yourself, because if you understand how air behaves, then you're going to be better poised to actually work on systems and evaluate what the system is doing if you really understand why air does what it does when it does.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because I was teaching a class in New York, and I asked a group of technicians, well, why is it when we have a heating system, let's say, a fossil fuel heating system, either gas fired, oil fired,
Yep.
and why do we sell customers humidifiers with the furnace? And the answer I got overwhelmingly, not from one individual, but from multiple individuals on multiple occasions. And the answer I got was, we sell a customer a humidifier because a humidifier puts back the moisture in the air that the furnace removes. And I'm like, wow. So you all believe that a furnace removes moisture
It dries air.
from the air?
I had heard the same thing growing up.
And the fact is, it doesn't. There's no drain
Right.
on a furnace carrying moisture away, right?
Right.
What
Don't
happens
get
is,
into
as we
condensing,
heat air, right? As we heat air, the amount of liquid moisture in the air decreases, right? So here, let me go. Let me take us here. So air, right? I think I hit one too many. Let's go back
Yeah.
one. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
So yeah. So when air is in equilibrium, when air is in its happy place,
Balance. Mhm.
yeah, we have. I mentioned this earlier. We have water vapor that's condensing into liquid water, and we have liquid water that's evaporating into vapor water. And when the rate of condensation and the rate of evaporation are equal, water reaches its happy place. It's in equilibrium.
Mhm. Comes in
So now,
saturation.
yeah. So let's think about when we heat air, right? So if air is being passed through a furnace, so if we add heat to something, right? Think about putting a pot of water on the stove in your house.
Mhm.
If you put a pot of water on the stove and you add heat to it, the water is going to vaporize. It's going to boil.
Right.
Common sense, we do that when we're making pasta, when we're, whatever we're doing. So if we heat air, what's happening is the rate of evaporation is increasing, and the rate of condensation is decreasing. So what happens is, when we heat air, we end up with more evaporation and less condensation. So the amount of liquid water in our air sample goes down.
Huh. Okay.
We now have more vapor water.
Right.
So what happens is, because liquid water is wet and water vapor is dry, then we get the dry skin, we get the furniture cracking, we get paint cracking, we get the soot, we get the dry throat.
Absolutely.
Right?
All common complaints.
So it's not that the amount of water in the air is decreasing, right? What we're doing is actually decreasing the amount of liquid water in the air. So and we're going to get to it in a little bit, but we're actually increasing the air's ability to hold moisture.
Sure.
So what we call the relative humidity goes down. So it's not that we're decreasing the amount of water. The amount of water in the air is
Still
staying the
there.
same, but the air's ability to hold moisture is increasing.
Okay.
So as Joe Kinder just mentioned, he timed in, as you know, as we heat air, the relative humidity drops.
Exactly.
So similarly, for you chill heads, for you cooling guys, when we cool air, now the rate of condensation is greater than the rate of evaporation. So now we end up with a larger amount of liquid water in the air,
Right.
right? So we're condensing a lot more than we're evaporating. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic when we're talking about what it is we're doing, whether we're heating it, when we're heating air or cooling air. So when we heat air or cool air, we're not necessarily changing the amount of moisture in the air, but we're changing the air's ability to hold moisture. And we'll, like I said, we'll chat about that in a little bit.
It's very interesting.
But yeah, it's a misconception, because it's funny that when they, when we heat air, that we put a humidifier to put, moisture back into the air.
Right.
So we're actually adding moisture to the air to increase the absolute humidity. Again, there are two kinds of humidity. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But like I said, it's just an interesting dynamic that we need to understand why we're doing what we're doing. We don't necessarily sell a humidifier to put moisture back into the air that the furnace is taking out.
Wow.
But yeah, so to understand what's going on, with air, it really does pay to take a look at the psychrometric chart. And that psychrometric chart that we showed a little ways ago, again, very intimidating, a lot of lines, and there aren't really that many different lines. There's just a lot of them.
Okay.
So, for example, we have what's called the dry bulb temperature.
Yep.
Right, and that's a temperature reading that you take with your standard thermometer, and those vertical lines on the psychrometric chart represent lines of constant dry bulb temperature. So, if a process, and again, this is humidifying or dehumidifying, again, jumping the gun a little bit, but if I move up or down on my psychrometric chart, my dry bulb temperature scale, or my dry bulb temperature, remains the same. So I'm not changing the temperature. If I add moisture to air or I remove moisture from air, I'm not necessarily changing the temperature of the air. So if you look at a psychrometric chart, the dry bulb temperature scale is along the bottom of the chart.
Yeah.
So you can see, okay, it's this temperature. And like I said, if I move up or down on that chart, that dry bulb temperature does not change. It's only if I move to the left or to the right that dry bulb temperature is going to change. So if I'm heating air, as indicated by the red arrow on this screen, then my dry bulb temperature is going to increase.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to move from left to right. If I cool the air, nothing else, I'm going to move from right to left, and my dry bulb temperature is going to drop.
Okay.
So the dry bulb temperature does not take moisture content into consideration at all. It's just the dry bulb temperature. Now, when we start getting into moisture content, then we have what's called wet bulb. And the wet bulb temperatures are all represented by these gently sloped lines on the psychrometric chart. Yeah. And again, the reason it gets confusing is because there are so many of them.
They're all going.
Yeah. And once the chart is populated with all of these lines moving in all different directions, then it gets a little intimidating.
Yeah. So
the wet bulb temperature, those temperature readings are located on the left side of the curve, on the left side of the psychrometric chart. All right. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Over there.
And as we stay on one of those lines, again, the wet bulb temperature does not change. It's only when we cross the lines. If we cross those lines, then the wet bulb temperature will change.
Move.
Yeah. So again, so far we looked at vertical lines. We looked at these gently sloped lines for our wet bulb temperature. And then And then there are steeper slope lines, and these are really, really neat because those represent lines of specific volume. And what specific volume means is how many cubic feet of air do I need to make 1 pound? And at standard conditions, when we said we have, 1 cubic foot of air weighs 0.075 pounds. Well, if you divide 1 by 0.075, you're going to get 13.33333. So if you can visualize, at standard conditions, you have 13 of your little containers behind you.
Mm-hmm.
They're full of air. Put them on a scale, and that's going to be 1 pound.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, we could take a psychrometric chart and we can plot out a process. We can plot out a cooling process where we measure the temperature and relative humidity before the air passes through the cooling coil, through the evaporator, and then measure the conditions again after. And we can actually plot these points on a chart to learn different things about the system. You can learn about the capacity and learn about, what the percentage of capacity is being dedicated to satisfying the
like sensible and latent capacities.
Sure. Drop in temperature, latent load, removing moisture. So just a couple of other quick things. So these are specific volume lines, but the specific volume lines, if I take the inverse of specific volume, that's going to give me density, just like we did with the 0.075 pounds per cubic foot.
Okay.
13.33 cubic feet per pound. So we can learn a lot about air by looking at where a specific point falls on the chart. So the horizontal lines on the chart do two things. Number one, it tells me how much moisture is in the air. So if I measure, let's say, the wet bulb and dry bulb temperature of air, I can plot that point on a chart, and it can tell me exactly how many grains of moisture are contained in each pound
of water.
Yeah, and a grain, really small measure of volume, measure of weight. 7,000 grains is 1 pound.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of psychrometric charts will give you the moisture content in grains of pounds of air, and also in pounds of moisture per pound of air. And then if you look at the other side, so that's on the right side, that's where we read our moisture content.
Sure.
But if you look on the left side of the chart, still on the horizontal lines, then that will give me my dew point temperature. So we're reading that on the same scale that we read our wet bulb temperature. It's the same temperature scale.
Yep.
So if you've ever taken a glass of a cold beverage, like ice water, and set it on the table, and then you lift it up and you have that water ring on the table. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the surface of that glass was below the dew point temperature of the air in the room.
Around it, yes.
Yeah. So when the air comes in contact with that glass, the moisture in the air starts condensing on the surface of the glass, and then you end up with that water ring. And for any of you who have to babysit young kids, this is a great babysitting exercise. So you lift up the glass and you see the watering on the table, and you convince the youngins that the glass has to have a leak in it, because why else
where's the water coming from?
On the table?
Yeah.
So you empty out the glass and you give it to them, and that keeps them busy for hours as they're looking for the leak.
Sounds like personal experience here.
Yeah, it's a great babysitting technique. I know my siblings are not happy with me right now if they're watching this, because now they know what I do with their kids when they would come over.
I love it.
Oh, Eugene, it doesn't look like they stressed you out at all. No, they were great. Yeah, I had them searching for non-existent water leaks in water glasses.
Mommy, don't drink from that glass. It's got a leak in it.
There you go. So another thing that's really neat with the psychrometric chart is relative humidity. So people ask, Eugene, why is the left side of that psychrometric chart curved? Why is it rounded? Well, that line actually represents 100% relative humidity. And the bottom of the chart represents 0% relative humidity.
Right.
And there are 9 other curved lines underneath that chart that each represent 10% relative humidity.
Mm.
So think about it. That bottom line represents 10%. As we go up one line, that's 10%, up 20%, 30%, 40%, until we get to 100% relative humidity, which is, the reference point on the chart. So if we take a look at this, as we cool air, which is that red arrow moving from right to left, that's a cooling only process. You can see that as we cool air, the relative humidity of the air is increasing, right? We're moving closer toward that 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as we humidify air, as we increase the moisture content, as indicated by that upward facing arrow,
Okay.
we're adding moisture to air, so the relative humidity is going up. So it's not that you have to memorize everything that's going on with air, but if you visualize the chart and you can picture a process moving on that chart, it's very easy to determine exactly what's happening. So for example, on the chart now, there's a red arrow moving from left to right. That arrow that's moving from left to right, that's increasing the dry bulb temperature, right? We said we're moving to the right.
Mm-hmm.
So the dry bulb temperature is increasing and the relative humidity is dropping. We're moving away from that 100% relative humidity line.
Sure.
And similarly, as we dehumidify, as we take moisture out of the air, we're moving from the top to the bottom. Once again, we're moving away from that 100% relative humidity line towards zero. So our relative humidity is dropping. So really, those are the main things we need to know about air. And the psychrometric chart really does enable us to, again, put those pieces together. So let me give you an example.
Yeah, definitely. Love to see that.
Yeah. So let's say we have an air sample, all right, and we used our psychrometer and we measure a dry bulb temperature of 70 degrees and a wet bulb temperature of 65.
Okay.
All right. So that's what our psychrometer tells us. So those two temperatures are going to identify a single point on that chart.
Yeah.
So the vertical line represents the 70-degree dry bulb. All right. And you can see on the bottom of the screen is at 70. And that gently sloped line, that diagonal line, is crossing the curve at 65 degrees. And these lines are marked across the left boundary of the chart. All right. And you can see that line is crossing the left boundary of that psychometric chart at 65 degrees. So now those two lines intersect at a point. And that point is now going to give us all of the other information that we need about that air sample.
Okay.
So, yeah. So for example, all right, I could tell you how much heat content in BTUs per pound is contained in that air sample. All right. So if I extend that wet bulb temperature line up, I'm now looking at an enthalpy scale. All right. And you can see from this chart that we're roughly about 30 BTUs per pound. So it doesn't matter how many pounds of air I have. If I have 10 pounds of air, then my enthalpy is still 30 BTUs per pound, right? It's not a summation, it's per pound. So I can extend my wet bulb temperature line up and I can determine how much heat content each pound of air has under those conditions.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's really not magic. So if I take that point and I move it directly to the right, and I can measure on my absolute humidity scale that I have roughly, let's say, 83 grains of moisture per pound.
Per pound.
Or 0.012 pounds of moisture per pound. Again, I can read it right off the scales on that chart. Right? So in addition to the absolute humidity, I can look at my dew point temperature. I take that point where we cross and move it right to the left. and I can see that my dew point temperature is about 62.5 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So if that air at 70-degree dry bulb, 65 wet, comes in contact with a surface that's
62.
cooler than 62.5 degrees, then moisture is going to start to condense out of the air. So I can also determine where that point is with respect to my relative humidity lines. So I see where that point lies, and I can see right now I'm at 50, 60, 70. I am almost at 80% relative humidity. So it's actually kind of neat because people think, oh, wow, Eugene, you memorize so much about air. I memorize nothing.
Memorize the chart or look at the chart and dive into it and plug it.
Clifton, I know 3 things. I get up in the morning, I know high voltage goes to low voltage. High pressure goes to low pressure. High temperature goes to low temperature. That's it. I'll get up in the morning. I look in the mirror. High voltage, low voltage, high pressure. I'm good to go. Everything else is a variation on the theme.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything else is a variation on the theme. So a couple of other things you can figure out. You can determine the specific volume. Right?
Yeah.
I can see that point, and I can see where that point lies with respect to those specific volume lines, those vertical lines. And this one is like 13.65 cubic feet per pound. So under those conditions of 70-degree wet, dry bulb, 65 wet, I need roughly 13.65 cubic feet of air to make 1 pound.
1 pound.
Yeah. So, it's really kind of cool because a lot of what air does is a mystery. So let me ask you a question. You've seen water, right? You have a bottle of water, it's kind of heavy, right? This weighs 1 pound. If you drink the water in this bottle, now the bottle is filled with air.
Yeah.
And that bottle is a lot lighter than this full bottle of water. So I kind of ask a leading question. When I guest lecture, I ask teachers, I ask students. So when we humidify air, here's the question. When we humidify air, when we add water to air, does it become more dense or less dense? All right? So wow, hold it. So water is heavier than air.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm asking you what seems to be a loaded question.
It does.
As we humidify air, does the air get heavier or does it get lighter?
I could tell you what I used to think. I could tell you what I was taught.
There you go. What were you taught?
That the air gets heavier when we add moisture to it because water has weight.
Well, think about it. I lived in Southern California in near desert conditions where we had very low relative humidity.
Right.
Now I live in West Palm Beach, Florida. And when I walked outside in Temecula, California, my shirt always stayed nice and dry because the relative humidity was really low. Now I walk outside and in about 32 milliseconds, my shirt is soaking wet.
Condensation.
So you take your shirt off and your shirt weighs a lot more than your shirt did out in Temecula.
Yeah.
So from our experience, from what we feel, if you go out and the air is very dry, it feels light and airy. You go out when it's after it rained and it feels very heavy.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that as air is humidified, it becomes lighter. And for those of you who you will be watching this next week or week after,
right, going, wait,
hear it again. But as you humidify an air sample, the air sample actually gets lighter. So take, for example, what you're looking at on the screen. Right now we have an air sample, a vertical line at 80 degrees, right? That 80-degree dry bulb temperature going up. And we have roughly 70 grains of moisture in that air sample. That's that bottom line, that horizontal line showing our initial point.
Yes.
And now let's say we add 50 grains of moisture to that air sample. When we add absolute humidity, the line goes straight up and down. We're not changing the
Right. Our
temperature of the
dry
air.
bulb didn't change.
Right? All we're doing, right, we're keeping the dry bulb the same, but we're changing the absolute humidity. And now that final point is due north of the initial one.
Right.
And now look at the specific volume. The specific volume was about 13.8 cubic feet per pound. And now the specific volume is up near 14 cubic feet per pound.
That's
Remember,
big.
specific volume tells us how many cubic feet we need to make 1 pound.
Sure.
Well, if we need more cubic feet to make 1 pound, that means each cubic foot weighs less, which means our density goes down. And for those of you that like the math, all right, the specific volume was initially 13.8 cubic feet per pound. The final value was 14 cubic feet per pound. So the density of the air went from 0.0725 pounds per cubic foot to 0.071 pounds per cubic foot. So the air actually got lighter. And you know what? I always tell my students, if you don't like what I say, tell me to prove it.
Yeah, here it is.
Right? Well, you know what? Well, think about this. Think about clouds.
That is a great question.
When you look up in the sky, you see clouds. You don't look down at your feet and see clouds. But what are clouds?
Moisture.
Right? Clouds are water. So the clouds are up. So I showed you on the psychometric chart that, moister air is lighter than drier air. I just mentioned clouds.
Mm-hmm.
And for those guys who love chemistry, here it is. So we said earlier, air is made up of nitrogen and oxygen. All right? And water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. And again, not to get too deep into this, but a nitrogen atom weighs 14 atomic mass units. An atomic mass unit is a unit of mass at the atomic level. Read it backwards.
Very good.
So
like
I tried.
That's a good twist.
A nitrogen molecule weighs 28 atomic mass units because a nitrogen molecule is N2. 2 atoms of nitrogen makes a nitrogen molecule. So a nitrogen molecule weighs 28 atomic mass units. Similarly, an oxygen molecule weighs 32 atomic mass units because 1 oxygen atom weighs 16 atomic mass units.
Okay.
So again, a molecule of water weighs 18 atomic mass units. One oxygen atom, 16. 2 hydrogen atoms at 1 atomic mass unit each. 16 plus 1 plus 1 is 18. So think about it. If I'm adding moisture to an air sample, right, I am putting in molecules that are lighter.
Right. And displacing out.
Yes, and they're displacing heavier molecules.
Yeah.
So I'm putting in molecules that weigh 18 atomic mass units, but I'm pushing out molecules that weigh either 28 or 32 atomic mass units.
That's crazy.
Isn't it? So I just showed you 3 ways. On the psychrometric chart, clouds, and on the chemical level.
Molecular weight.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of neat.
Boy, that makes you think for a second. I mean, those are very realistic explanations.
Well, think
of what
about
we're doing with air.
Yeah, think about it. If you're air conditioning a system and the air in the house is very dry, you would think, oh, it's lighter. It's making the work on the blower easier. But the air is actually heavier. The blower is actually working harder to move dry air than humid air. Again, something to think about.
Boy, that's a brain racker right there.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's a great one. That's why we do this.
Too late today to hit you with this stuff, right?
We help correct the things that we didn't learn properly if we just learned out in the field and didn't get formal training on fundamentals.
But you know what? It really is only, I'm telling you. So what did we look at? We looked at wet bulb temperature. We looked at dry bulb temperature. We looked at absolute humidity, relative humidity, dew point temperature, specific volume, density, enthalpy, and it's actually kind of interesting. But there's one other thing that's really, really cool, that we can get from this chart, and that's sensible heat ratio.
Okay.
So you hear about that all the time.
Yes.
Or sensible heat factor.
Right.
Same deal.
Depends on who's saying.
And what sensible heat ratio is, it's really the ratio of the sensible heat portion of our capacity to the total capacity of the system.
Right.
And sensible heat ratio can range from 0 to 1. So if you and really the sensible heat ratio is going to be determined at the time a system is designed. What's the application? Are we dealing with a computer room application? Right? In a computer room application, we're cooling computers. So there are no people. So there's no perspiration, there's no sweating, there's no, right? So there's no latent load on the system.
It's
so
just
the
sensible heat
factor is like 1.
Yeah. That's the majority of our space.
Yeah. So, but if you're looking for comfort cooling, then we typically operate with sensible heat factors about 0.65 to 0.8. So it's actually really, really important. So sensible heat ratio can be calculated mathematically, all right? And there are formulas, all right? And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the formulas, but let's say we have a cooling load, total cooling load of 48,000 BTUs and a sensible load of 38,400 BTUs. And if we divide the sensible load by the total load, which is in this case 38,400 by 48,000,
48, yeah.
we get a sensible heat ratio of 0.8 to 80%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay? So that's fine. That's all well and good. That's math. Math is cool, but the psychrometric chart is even cooler. All right? Because we can determine sensible heat ratio right from the psychrometric chart. So one thing that's neat is on a psychrometric chart, there's a reference point. In some cases, it's 80 degrees at 50% relative humidity. So if you look at a psychrometric chart, you're going to see this little dot. It's a little reference dot. I call it the magic dot because it's magic. All right. And what happens with that dot is we draw a line that's parallel to the process that we're doing, return air, supply air. And then we can determine by reading off the right-hand side of the chart what that sensible heat ratio is. Okay. So on the right side, on the right side
factor chart.
Yeah, on the right side of that psychrometric chart, there's a scale for sensible heat ratio or sensible heat factor. If you look at those numbers, 0.35, 0.40, 0.45, they're all at a different angle. If you draw a line extending each of those numbers, 0.35, 0.4, 0.5, they're all going to converge at that reference point on the chart. All right?
Yep.
So each of those lines has a different slope. So let me jump ahead and show you. So right there, those are your sensible heat ratio scales.
Right.
Let's look at a real system. All right. So we have return air. Here's an air conditioning system. And the air before the cooling coil is 75 degrees at 50% relative humidity. The supply air right after the evaporator coil is 55 degrees at 90% relative humidity. Right? Boom. Okay. Well, follow these steps. Don't follow those steps. Listen to Eugene. He'll show you right now. Okay. So we got 2 points. We have our return air. We have our supply air.
It's got a temperature rise or split or differential, whatever you call it.
Yeah. So now we have 2 points. So we have 1 point representing the return air, which is at 75 degrees, 50% relative humidity.
Okay.
With the other line to the left side that's marked supply air, that's at 55 degrees, 90% relative humidity. And I connect those 2 lines, those 2 points. And I have 1 line. So you see there's 1 line connecting the return air to the supply air. Now, all I have to do is draw a line parallel to that process line that's passing through that reference point. Remember that magic point that I was talking about? So if you draw a line parallel to that process line, because the process is giving you the slope, and it passes through that reference point, and you extend it all the way to the right of the chart, you can read the sensible heat ratio. In this case, it's 0.83.
That's pretty quick.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I don't need to do any mathematical calculations.
No, it's visual.
Now, you could. All right, here's all the math, right? The sensible heat formula is 1.08 times CFM times delta T. QT total is 4.5 times CFM times delta H. You could get the change in temperature off the dry bulb scale. You can get the delta H off the enthalpy scale and plug in. You don't need the CFM, although CFM is in both of those formulas. You're dividing QS divided by QT. The CFM cancels out.
Oh, sure. Yeah, not necessary.
Yeah, so you don't even need it. And then what's going to happen is, again, for you people who love numbers, all right, we can actually take those numbers. The delta T is 75 minus 55, 20. The change in enthalpy is 28.2, excuse me, minus 22.4. So that's 5.8 BTUs per pound. And then we can plug those numbers into the formula, right? QS over QT, sensible heat ratio, QS over QT, 1.08 times delta T divided by 4.5 times delta H. Remember, the CFM cancels out. The delta T was 20. The delta H was 5.8. If you plug in the numbers and calculate, QS over QT, 0.83, right? So you can read it right off the chart without having to go through the calculations.
Exactly.
So it's magic. So, you know what, Clifton, there's a couple of other things that, again, really, really powerful tools with the psychrometric chart and with that sensible heat ratio. But I do want to chat really quickly, because a lot of people get confused with sensible heat ratio and efficiency, but sensible heat ratio really doesn't play into the efficiency side. It really plays into evaporator selection.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, when you're selecting an evaporator, you want to do so based on the applications.
Right.
So you've probably seen evaporators that are very thin, maybe with one row of tubes, and then you've seen evaporators that are very thick, might have 3, 4, 5 rows of tubes. And when you have a thin evaporator coil, that is for high sensible heat ratio applications, like computer rooms.
Sure.
Think about it. When you go outside and you look at a condenser coil, does the condenser coil, picture a condenser coil on a unit you've looked at recently.
Yep.
Does the condenser coil in your mind have 5, 6 rows thick, or does it have 1 or 2?
Just 1 or 2.
1 or 2, right? Because we don't care about moisture content of the outside air. We are looking to transfer sensible heat. So the coil is thin, all right? Because think about what would happen on a thick coil. All right, let's go back to an evaporator. If I have a low sensible heat ratio, that means I have more of a latent load. So if I'm in a gym, I'm going to design an air conditioning system for a gymnasium with a low sensible heat ratio, which means I have a high latent load.
High latent, absolutely. A lot of perspiration. Yeah, absolutely.
So think about what
breathing.
Happens. Yeah. Picture a coil that has a bunch of rows. Okay. So look at that bottom coil now, the thicker coil. Air from the space goes into that coil. It hits the first row of tubes. The air gets cooler. Now it hits the second row, and it gets cooler yet. It hits the third row. It gets even cooler. The air is now being cooled to a temperature below the dew point temperature of the air, and now the moisture begins to condense out of the airstream.
Absolutely.
If we have a coil like at the top, the air hits the coil and then boom, is discharged. So we're dealing with dropping the temperature of the air, not necessarily the moisture content of the air.
We're transferring it fast.
Yeah. So we're looking at reducing the temperature of the air, not removing moisture from the air. So going back to this one, so if I have a thicker evaporator coil, what we're really doing is we're increasing the amount of time that the air stays in contact with the coil. So we're going to get more dehumidification.
Yep.
All right.
Completely makes sense.
Yeah. So you can't take an air conditioning system that was designed for a computer room and now magically change the computer room into a gymnasium and expect it to work. Because the evaporator coil was designed for applications.
For a particular purpose.
Yeah, for a computer room application where there's a very high sensible heat ratio, no latent load.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting.
Man, I'd never thought of it from that perspective. I'd always been taught that the more rows, the slower the the passing rate of heat transfer. So we had the opportunity to remove more moisture, but didn't really understand what we were doing. I knew the why, I just didn't know the how.
Yeah, kind of again. I always say whenever I do a class, whenever I do a lecture, whenever I do a session, it's always, if we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. So we really just have to look at things a little differently. So two other quick points I'd love to share. And one is what we call the ADP, the apparatus dew point. And you'll see that in spec sheets. And the apparatus dew point is basically, what the temperature of the airstream would be if all the air came in contact with the coil.
Yes, exactly.
And when you have a relative humidity of 90% or 95% of your supply air, that means that not all the air is coming in contact with the coil.
Yep.
Because if all the air came in contact with the coil, we would have a relative humidity of 100%. All right. So think about it. The apparatus dew point is found on the psychrometric chart along the 100% relative humidity line.
Sure. That's its maximum capability.
Yeah. So apparatus dew point, again, is the air temperature if all the air actually came in contact with the coil.
Okay.
So if you want to figure out what the apparatus dew point temperature is, you actually extend the process. So on this chart here, we have return air. All right. The dot representing return air. We have a dot representing supply air. And then all we have to do is extend the process line until it hits the 100%
of course
humidity line.
Right.
That's going to give us the apparatus dew point.
Yep.
So here's some really cool stuff with the apparatus dew point. Again, you don't have to do a lot of math.
No, you just need a bunch of rulers.
But yeah, now if you know what the apparatus dew point is, you subtract 10 degrees from that, and that gives you your evaporator saturation temperature. That's telling you the temperature at which the refrigerant is boiling in the evaporator.
Yeah.
And then you can look up on your PT chart what your low side pressure should be.
Should be.
Yeah.
Wow.
Again, all from this chart. Return air, supply air, plot it, and here you go. So it's if you know your return and supply air conditions, you can actually estimate your evaporator saturation temperature without gauging up on the system.
Love it.
The more the more you can do without gauging up on a system, the better
absolutely.
you are.
Yeah.
Right?
I teach hands off on gauges on a system. We use manifold gauges as a last resort.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. So check this one out. So with the apparatus dew point, if you know the apparatus dew point, you know your return air temperature, you know your supply air temperature, you can actually calculate how much air is bypassing the coil.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So again, for those of you guys that love math, so for comfort cooling applications, you're looking at a bypass factor of 0.3 to 0.5.
Mm-hmm.
Retail shops, different restaurants, hospitals, 100% outside air, you're going to have 0.01, 0.1. But look at the math real quick. It's kind of neat. It's kind of fun. So BPF, bypass factor, is the supply air temperature. These are all dry bulb, no wet bulb temperatures. Supply air temperature minus the coil temperature. Coil temperature, by the way, is the ADP.
Mm-hmm.
That's the apparatus dew point. So supply air temp minus the apparatus dew point divided by the return air temp minus the apparatus dew point. All right? All dry bulb temperatures. Mm-hmm. Supply air minus ADP divided by return air minus ADP. And if you calculate that, right? So let's say we have return air is 76 degrees, supply air 55 degrees, and my apparatus dew point's 51 degrees, right? I can calculate that. 76 minus 51 divided by 55 minus 51, and that's going to tell me, okay, my bypass factor is 0.16. So I know 16% of my air is bypassing the coil.
Yeah,
and then
some way.
Yeah, and then I can compare that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We're looking at 0.3 to 0.5 for residential for comfort cooling.
Exactly. But it lets us know what the scenario is. What kind of condition do we have inside of that plenum?
Yeah. What if you had a coil sitting inside a plenum that was way too large? You get bypass factors of 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, and you're out there and you're a technician and you're throwing refrigerant into the system.
Right.
Well, it's not you. It's air bypassing the coil.
Yeah.
And then 1 minus bypass factor tells you the contact factor. Okay? So if 0.16, if 16% of the air is bypassing the coil, then I know that 84% of the air is coming in contact with the coil.
Yep, exactly.
Kind of neat stuff. So
that is really cool, Eugene. I've never had it explained that well.
I've chatted about psychrometrics. I mean, I could do 8-hour, 10-hour, 2-day, 3-day.
I could see that.
And to try and put 10 pounds of gumballs in a 5-pound bag. It was actually kind of exciting. We actually were able to do it. But I would love to continue the discussion on this because, like I said, this is
a lot to dive into.
Topics that I'm super, super passionate about. And, I just appreciate you having me on so I can babble about it. You kind of took the back seat and said, okay, you can run with it.
And I want to, because this is one of those topics I myself have to learn. And I know there are a lot of people out there. Donald Baker, I really appreciate you chiming in. This is just really high quality content. Like I said, many of us end up in the role of educator, not realizing how much we missed. Like for me, so I have been taking our CSME exams, right? I started them before I even came to ESCO because I wanted to learn what I didn't know. And it's not until we start testing ourselves that we find out that there are a lot of things that we may not have learned properly along the way.
And you know what? That's a big thing, Clifton, because when I first started taking my CSME exams, I finished back in 2010.
Yep.
And when I finished mine, I think I was the 23rd or the 24th person in the country.
Wow.
To get the CMHE credential. And I started taking those exams because I really wanted to learn about what I didn't know. Because even if you got an 80% on an exam, that means there's 20% you didn't know.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, you know what? And so even for technicians or teachers, you always want to strive. You always want to try and learn about what you don't know. And we don't always know what we don't know. Right?
I definitely didn't.
Yeah, a lot of people don't want to know what they don't know. I know enough. I get paid every week. I know enough. I know enough to get paid.
Yeah, and I do hear that sometimes. It's discouraging, but it is out there.
You might get paid enough, right? You might know enough to get paid.
Right.
But do you really know enough to make a difference?
Exactly. Because that's really what it comes down to.
That's what it is. You need to invest in yourself. You always say that, Clifton. You really need to take time and invest in yourself. And the more we can learn, you can have everything you have taken away from you. You can have your house, your car, and anything you own could be gone the next day. The one thing that you can't have taken away from you is what's in here.
Yeah. For many of us, we believe our legacy is to leave this place better than we found it and to give more than we've been given. And the only way we can do that is to fill ourselves better.
Oh, absolutely.
And I encourage all of you. If you want to learn more about this program, this particular content comes from Eugene's book that you can get right here in our bookstore. So if you need to take a screenshot, grab a quick photo of that, I'll leave that one in here. We've also, go ahead. Oh,
No,
behind you. That's right.
I'm like,
It's on the
oh,
backdrop.
there.
And if you're traveling, you're flying, you're just chilling, and you want to have a digital version, you can also grab this on Amazon and Kindle version. So all of this is available resources. We're here to be better together and to just contribute and help the next generation be hopefully better than we were when we were at the same place and time.
That's what it's all about.
Well,
I appreciate you having me.
Eugene, it is always an honor, and I absolutely cherish this time to learn and grow from you, and I know everyone else does. There's a couple of minutes, a little bit of time. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask, if they need any additional resources, hop in the chat. We'll hang out here just for another minute or so, and then we'll wrap it up for the day. Yeah, see some people out there scanning that QR code. Good for you.
That was me.
Oh,
I'm kidding.
All right.
Donald, thanks for joining. Joe, nice to see you. Bob, always a pleasure. Mick's training from UK. Very cool.
Yeah, I love that, Mick. And Lizaraga, I hope I got that correct. Thank you out there.
Awesome.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up for this week. We appreciate all of you sincerely, and we will see you next week on Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC show. Bye, all.